Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with a story about another crazy landlord. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. And our first story. Landlord won't let me stay till end of the month, but expects me to pay for the full month. Years ago, I had a terrible landlord who would enter my place whenever he felt like it because it was the only way to access the furnace and telecommunications equipment for his business upstairs. A year and a half later, I'd finally had enough and bought a condo. I gave him a month's notice as per the lease. The closing was on the 15th of the following month and was giving him my 30 days notice and included a check for half month's rent. First, he tried to say I owed him for the remainder of the lease year, stating that it had automatically renewed at the end of the original term. I said yes, it had, on a month-to-month term. He had to consult his lawyer, who apparently told him I was right. His next trick was to state that there was no proration, I owed the full month. Okay, fine. I informed him that works for me since my closing was postponed by 2 weeks, so since I apparently had to pay for the full month now anyway, I was going to remain in residence through the end of the month. Boy, was he livid. No, he said, that would be impossible since he already had renters scheduled to move in on the 16th. He informed me he would be changing the locks if I wasn't out by the 15th. Huh? Okay, great. That would constitute an illegal eviction, but whatever. I simply stated I would be happy to comply with this request to vacate by the 15th and would not be paying for any days he was not allowing me to live there, and hinted that should he have any further issues with this, he should take it up with my lawyer, who had already been forwarded the proof of his threat to conduct an illegal self-help eviction. He had nothing else to say, and I lived with my parents for 2 weeks and saved some money. And our second story. You're threatening to call the police? Please do. A group of around a dozen of us went to a curry restaurant in the high street of a town in the UK. There was only one other table occupied on what should have been a busy Saturday night. We ordered our starters and main courses without issue. After a very long time, at least half an hour, some food started appearing from the kitchen. A couple of starters for some people, some mains for others who hadn't gotten their starters yet. About half of us had food of some kind at this point. However, the waiter then decided to inform us some dishes were not available that night. The food that did come out was terrible and in some cases actually cold. Meanwhile, the other table took the opportunity of a quiet moment in the restaurant to just walk out the door, leaving untouched food on the table and not paying. That was a step too far in my book, but irrelevant to us. Disgusted by the food situation, we offered to pay £10 per person to abandon the meal. This was quite reasonable given the quantity of food that had come out. The manager refused and tried to make us pay for the entire meal, even though we hadn't even received half of it. Nor would we ever get some dishes as they were not available. I estimate it should have cost around £15 per head. At this point, he decided to lock the door of the restaurant and threatened to call the police. We complied. Please do, we replied. The police were there in minutes, walking in through the now unlocked door. They talked to us, then talked to the manager, then came back to us. How about you offer the restaurant £5 per person to end the situation, the officer suggested. Everybody agreed, including the manager, who pretty much had no choice now, so we paid up half our original offer and left. The restaurant closed permanently sometime later. And our last story. My friend's ex-wife gets his family's business shut down and burns their lives to the ground. This story isn't about me, but two people I'm friends with. We'll call one Ray and one Justin. Some background. Ray and Justin grew up in an extremely restrictive, insular religious community that borders on being a cult. They both read a lot from a young age, even though reading outside of their religion's material was discouraged, so both of them grew increasingly skeptical and dissatisfied with their environment due to having this peek into the outside world. In high school, this shared mindset brought them together, and they started secretly dating. For context, dating was absolutely strictly verboten in this religious community. You went straight from single to married with zero in between. So when Justin and Ray's parents caught them dating, they forced them to get married. To be clear, it wasn't like they were even having sex. They basically were driving around together and holding hands in the downtown square where all the kids hung out. Very tame, sheltered kid stuff. Ray and Justin started living together as husband and wife, but unfortunately for their families, putting those two together doubled their resiliency, and together they cooked up a plan to get out. They set up a secret bank account at a bank outside the religious community's influence since their families had access to their accounts, and everyone who worked at the main bank was also in the same community and gossiped about everyone's financial transactions. They started squirreling away money in small amounts the families wouldn't question being missing from their paychecks. When they were 20, they finally had enough money to start over, and they got out. They basically left their house in the dead of night with nothing but what could fit in their car and uprooted to live across the country. Pretty quickly after they moved, they decided to get amicably divorced. Since they never wanted to be married anyway, they still lived together for a while and basically became something between platonic roommates and each other's only family. Over time, they started dating other people. Some partners were scared off by the weird relationship between them, but most got it and understood that Justin and Ray had basically bonded through mutual trauma. I also met both of them during this time, and we became close friends. This whole time, both their families and other members of their community were relentlessly harassing them. People were showing up at their house at all hours, and they had reason to believe people were trying to steal their identities over the years, though they'd fortunately both put a freeze on their credit, so nothing ever came of it. Then Justin had a bad accident. A really bad accident. He was on his bike and a car blew through a stop sign without slowing down and plowed right into him. He had to be rushed to the hospital and landed in the ICU. Ray was his emergency contact, and I was with her and some other friends when she got the call. I immediately drove her to the hospital with a couple of other people, and she was melting down, understandably. The hospital staff wouldn't let us all in when we got there, but they let Ray in. She came out periodically to let us know what was going on. Justin wasn't unconscious, but he was totally out of it and didn't seem to know she was there, probably from the painkillers. But she was convinced he had permanent debilitating brain damage, and basically the group of us were just soothing her and reassuring her it would be fine. A friend of ours who worked at the hospital as an MRI tech was also stopping by when she could on her breaks and calming down Ray. We'd been there all night and part of the day at this point, and the medical staff was giving us reason to be hopeful. But things got worse. To this day, no one knows how they found out, but 14 hours after Justin's accident, his parents, uncles, and grandfather showed up. They immediately had us all removed from the ICU, Ray included. Unfortunately, as his ex-wife, she was no longer his legal next of kin and had no rights against his blood family. At this point, she was absolutely hysterical and inconsolable. She was convinced Justin's family would hurt him. I'm ashamed to say all three of us that were there thought that she was overreacting. We all knew Ray and Justin had left a effed up situation, but it wasn't like his own family would do anything to impede his recovery. She was getting angry with us for trying to calm her down and tried to explain that according to their religion, she and Justin deserved punishment from God, and only the greatest suffering could prompt repenting and redemption. She said their families embraced this thinking and wanted them to suffer because it would prove that they did this wrong thing by leaving, and suffering would drive them back to the fold. She said as long as Justin was with his family, he wouldn't be safe. Our friend who worked for the hospital came and found Ray at that point. She made Ray swear up and down that she wouldn't tell anyone she told her this because she could get in deep trouble for releasing privileged information to someone unauthorized. But she'd caught wind that Justin's parents were aggressively demanding the hospital release him into their care, and they were involving lawyers. The hospital was currently refusing because Justin wasn't stable enough to leave, but our friend warned Ray that as soon as Justin got to be stable or the lawyers scared the hospital enough, it's possible the parents would be able to take Justin. This shocked the rest of us. Realizing his parents were not only willing to remove Justin from the hospital that had saved his life and the condition he was in, but were actively trying to do it, made us really get for the first time why Ray was going out of her head with fear. At this point, Ray snapped into a do-or-die mode. Convinced that Justin was about to literally die if she didn't act, she decided she would do everything in her power to start a fire at home so that Justin's family would want to run back and put it out. And this wasn't too hard because she had a lot of dirt on the whole community she came from. Like a madwoman, she started blowing the whistle all over Justin's family. She called the IRS's fraud hotline and detailed all the ways that the family business was committing tax fraud. She submitted an ATF tip about how that same family business was illegally selling firearms without a license and without following any of the proper protocols, and was knowingly selling guns to convicted felons. She reported one of Justin's uncles for owning several guns as a convicted felon. She also reported Justin's mom's unlicensed daycare business, which was apparently extremely shady, including having over 30 children packed into one house, with Justin's mom as the only adult and many of the childcare duties being farmed out to Justin's 12 and 14-year-old sisters. She called CPS on Justin's uncles and his parents for keeping their children out of school and for physical abuse in one uncle's case. In all these reports, she provided extensive details. She finished her calls and emails, and then she waited. We all waited for several hours, and nothing happened. Then, miraculously, Justin became lucid enough to understand what was going on and make his own decisions, and he kicked his family out again. From there began a slow but steady path to recovery. In all the relief and excitement to see Justin on the mend, we'd almost forgotten about Ray's campaign of desperation until a couple of weeks later when the screaming voicemail started pouring in to both of them. First, the business was being investigated by the IRS. Then it was being investigated for illegal firearms dealing. Then the daycare was getting investigated. At first, Ray felt a little guilty, but then she was like, you know what? No regrets. They would have killed Justin. From what they've been able to piece together in the year and a half since this happened, the business has gone under, and the daycare is shuttered. The uncle is 6 months into a new 5-year prison sentence for firearm possession. CPS investigated, which scared the crap out of the family, but nothing really came of it, which is especially sad in the case of the cousins being physically abused. That said, the parents are now too scared to keep the daughters home from school, and with the unlicensed daycare shut down, the mom's not exploiting her daughter's labor anyway, so she has no incentive to keep them home. So Justin's little siblings are at least getting their education. Justin and Ray are both happy and thriving. Justin, unfortunately, will never fully recover from the accident. He has some permanent neurological damage that results in tremors, but he's pumped to be alive. He can work a full-time job, he can still be pretty physically active, and as far as I'm concerned, he wins. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.